Let me start with a few introductory remarks. As we know all, the conception of a well-ordered democracy must respect various constraints. On the one hand, there is the basic idea of free and equal citizenship that needs to be practiced and sustained. Famously, John Rawls put this idea, but other authors as well. And its implementation faces a specific challenge represented by the fact of pluralism. So respect of freedom and equality must go together with the respect of pluralism. Neglecting some of the legitimate worldviews or favoring against them other worldviews in the pluralist space represents treating some persons like less than equal. On the other hand, equal citizenship in the political process must answer to the challenge represented by the fact that we are not epistemic peers. For example, some people are more competent than others, some others are under the influence of beliefs that are not supported by serious evidence, and so on. A consequence of this fact in general, as well as in specific fields, is that equality in the process of public decision-making risks causing epistemic degeneration of this process and shaping democracy as the rule of ignorance. In the current time, the risk is visible through the phenomenon of divulgation of fake news with political and public influence and effects. And okay, I'm skipping on. Examples include recent insurrection or attempt of insurrection in the United States, which, however, shows very clearly the dangers of collective delusions caused by misinformation. In the democratic process, we must look for the proper consideration of political values without neglecting epistemic virtues. And in fact, it seems also from today's symposium that this is the major challenge for liberal thought in upcoming and actual time, and also the new challenge for the RAWLSIAN political thought. The problem consists in assessing the proper way to operationalize them at proper balance. We can find an appropriate, so I think, however, that we can find an appropriate framework by looking back in John Rawls' work. So my opinion is that even the epistemological element is already present in his thought, and that we can still find some or many precious motivations. So I refer to his theory of legitimacy and his conception of justification of public decisions, represented by the theory of public reason. But contrary to the usual debate, and similarly to what Fabienne is doing, I highlight the focus on epistemic elements in his doctrine of public justification. Again, I repeat the difference with Fabienne that perhaps certainly I'm more loyal Rawlsian. In particular, I remark the epistemological function of methods and conclusions of science when these are not controversial, as valid public reasons. But I propose a revision of this definition of a kind of valid public reasons. In fact, Rawlsian disputes have visibly a focus more on the moral and political aspect of public reason than on those epistemological. This is because such disputes deal primarily with conflicts among political and moral standards. But in my view, the epistemic element that is present in Rawls' theory deserves to be more vividly recognized and taken in consideration. This is, for example, because respect of basic rights and liberties, as well as basic justice, that is the main Rawls concerns, also involves assessing facts that are not moral or political per se, but guide moral or political conclusions. For example, in a time of pandemic like the current COVID-19, some restrictions of basic rights and liberties appear to be required, and this is assessed on the basis of beliefs that regard facts. But people diverge, even in vehement public confrontation, about which restrictions are justified and which are not. The content of such confrontations reveals that we need to employ epistemological elements in public justification and not only those moral and political. Some divergences, for example, depend on interferences of pseudoscience and fake news, which highlights the importance of the epistemological side of Rawls' characterization of public reason. This is a challenge for which Rawls offers a ready answer, namely, among valid public reasons there are presently accepted general beliefs and forms of reasoning found in common sense. Okay, this is not important for today's discussion, and the methods and conclusions of science when these are not controversial. The set of public reasons constituted by conclusions and methods of science is particularly important for the present paper. This is an important identification of a public reason, but in my view, such definition of the epistemic condition of valid public reasons needs to be amended. Like we see in practice, we need frequently to make public decisions by relying on science, while there are still disagreements in the scientific community. Okay, probably here we enter in the space mentioned earlier by Fabienne, 100% of decisions with 50% of certainty or probability. The situation is not always fortunately sharp, that we have actual consensus in science and an unequivocal determination of the best supported beliefs. Rawlsian determination is thus too narrow of the public reason when science is involved. The Rawlsian project needs to deal with more complicated cases than those that can be adjudicated through uncontroversial conclusions and methods of science. I judge this determination of a public reason as a good declaration of epistemic seriousness, but in need of refinement because it is not sufficiently responsive to real-life challenges. So I propose to amend it. We need a more inclusive definition of public reason for the employment of scientific resources in public justification. As an illustration, I mention a problem related to the actual pandemic. In such a condition, we deal with a previously unknown organism that requires biomedical and biotechnological research as a work in progress and causes disagreement even among experts. Disagreement about policies and public decisions can be even stronger among experts of different fields when they debate about public policies. For example, economists can push for policies that sustain economy, while epidemiologists can push for policies that favor public health. At stake, there are matters of basic rights and liberties and questions of basic justice. The problem that appears here is how to manage a condition when there is disagreement among experts, either because questions are not resolved in a field of expertise or because different fields of expertise recommend different decisions. The Rawlsian project disposes, in general, of resources to deal with this problem. To start, it is compatible with the legitimacy of decisions that are currently undefeated by valid public reasons and are fairly well supported by them, even though their justification is not conclusive and victorious. This inconclusiveness, however, raises the need for some elaboration, because it appears to create a situation of impasse. The specific Rawlsian solution to this impasse caused by inconclusiveness is constituted by two steps. First, there is a less stringent qualification of legitimate decisions in opposition to those of the correctness view of legitimacy that appeals to truth of the best reasons. I prefer not to speak about objectivity in this case because RAWLSIAN or Rawls himself declares in fact to have his own concept of objectivity, and thus I prefer to speak about correctness views. Instead of the concept of truth, Rawls employs the concept of reasonableness. Second, there is the possibility of procedural resolution. After valid public reasons are established, and it has been seen that they lead to inconclusive justification, the final adjudication can be done through a fair procedure. The distinct feature of reasonableness when we speak about public decisions for the present discussion is the fact that they are justified, so the decisions are justified through valid public reasons. They are not the result of blameworthy flaws, like blameworthy epistemic flaws. Further, persons that support them show epistemic virtues. The choice of reasonableness as the legitimacy conferring virtue instead of truth has several comparative merits. Insisting on truth as a criterion of legitimacy in conditions of reasonable pluralism instead of reasonableness has deleterious political consequences. In such a condition, each side will try to impose its own view, although it is just one of the parts in a condition of pluralism. The result will be a return to a kind of state of nature instead of proper social cooperation, as Jerry Gauss wrote in 2014. To Gauss' reason for denying that attributing the legitimacy conferring value to nothing less than truth, or the best reasons, in conditions of reasonable pluralism, we can add an epistemological consideration as well. Well, when and while truth is not ascertained, and there is reasonable pluralism about it, appealing to truth for making decisions and finding solutions in order to solve problems is ephemeral. We only have what persons think is the truth, not the truth. This is a worrisome condition if truth, or more in general correctness, is our necessary criterion of legitimacy. But RAWLSIANs say that this is not a desperate situation. The RAWLSIAN reaction is to rely on the virtue that we have realistically at our disposal in a condition of reasonable pluralism, and this is reasonableness. Reasonableness as a legitimacy conferring virtue needs some further elaboration. What I have in mind here is that reasonableness, contrary to truth, does not require unequivocal answers. As an illustration, imagine that we debate public policy of containment of the pandemic, which obviously partly depends on scientific thesis. Imagine also that the scientific community accepts relevant facts, which are part of its common repository, but some scientists attribute more importance to some facts, others to other facts. They can diverge, for example, in the attribution of probabilities because of the different way they attribute to the relevance of various facts. Thus, an issue can be whether to introduce more or less coercive public policies in order to protect public health. A group of scientists attributes high probability to the expectation that the population will manifest widely the sense of social responsibility in following non-coercive recommendations for the containment of the pandemic, because of the culture of respecting public institutions generally present in society. Other scientists think that the probability of non-coercive compliance with recommendations is small, because of the relevant interests or psychological dispositions harmed by the measures, and thus they insist on more coercive policies. Here we can have, and we effectively have, inconclusiveness. This is a problem because we do not have a clear ground for a public decision. In fact, we do not have a clear public reason according to Rawls' original definition. This is because the condition to be a valid public reason is to be an uncontroversial conclusion of science. In fact, here we have controversial scientific conclusions, and it is not clear which scientific conclusion we can assume as a public reason for the justification of a public policy. Apparently, we are in a situation of impasse and impossibility to appeal to scientific reasons as valid public reasons. But on the other hand, we need the support of science to make qualified public decisions, even when its conclusions are not uncontroversial. This is why I propose to amend Rawls' definition of valid public reasons. I start by indicating the positive resources that we have in the previous illustration. First, we have a set of valid public reasons that are recognized as such among scientists. This set of valid public reasons permits us, first, to exclude some conclusions like unreasonable and not admitted in public justification because of not being supported by valid reasons, and second, to have a set of inconclusively justified scientific theses. Contrary to unreasonable conclusions like fake news or pseudoscience, the latter are supported by valid public reasons. In fact, they represent a set of eligible conclusions of science, and we do better not to give up this resource that we have and treating them as if not having any merit like pseudoscience and fake news. After all, they are the best that we have. For this reason, I propose a revision of Rawls' determination of public reason when scientific reasons are concerned. Instead of methods and conclusions of science when these are not controversial, I propose methods and conclusions of science when these are not controversial, and proposals that are in the set of eligible conclusions of science. Appeal to eligible conclusions of science will justify variegated policies. The problem that appears now is which one do we have to choose if we cannot postpone the decision? In other words, which is the policy that is legitimate after all? In my view, it is legitimate to endorse any of the controversial policies among those that are sustained by scientific valid public reasons. The proper resolution is represented by a fair democratic procedure. This completes the respect of all reasonable persons as equal. Namely, after they have been treated as equals in virtue of the equal consideration of their reasonable stances, they are again treated like equals, this time procedurally. And by this I end. So I thank you very much for your attention. So,
Hana is not here.
this is the reason why I didn't hear anything.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what happened, but probably, you know, she didn't expect that you will finish first. So I will take for a while her role, and I'm opening the discussion. So, is there raised hands? Okay, Fabienne, so please.
Thank you, Snežana. Well, that's very interesting, and I can't say I disagree, but I was perhaps ask for a clarification with regard to your use of reasonableness. So in Rawls' original formulation, and you made that perfectly clear, it has these two components, right, with regard to proposing fair terms of cooperation, so reasonableness contrasts with rationality in that sense, where you're just after your own good. And the second dimension is respecting the burdens of judgment, which I understand as respecting the limits of what even the best deliberation can do for us, right? So there's an epistemic component here, but it's very much a sort of a pessimistic epistemic component, right? That don't think that deliberation will get you to a consensus, as opposed to perhaps a sort of more directly epistemic sense of reasonableness, which is your contribution should be a best response to the evidence, or something of the sort, right? And I was wondering whether at times you used both senses, you refer to the epistemic dimension in both senses. You were going back and forth, but maybe not. I was just wondering how you thought about the epistemic component of reasonableness.
Oh, thank you very much, Fabienne, for your question. And in fact, yes, I go in both directions, as you said, because it seems to me that Rawls' the discussion of burdens of judgment has two sides, in effect. So there is the pessimistic side that you say there are our limits because of these burdens, but then there are the optimistic side. So here is the disagreement where we arrive, not because of epistemic flaws, not because of negligence, not because not being serious, shallow, and so on, but because even though we have been serious, engaged, conscientious, and then perhaps this is central is an addition, and we manifested even epistemic virtues. Nonetheless, we arrive at this condition of disagreement because of burdens of judgment. So, in fact, I think this is a part of Rawls' epistemology, even though because he's very much engaged in the questions of pluralism, it's more remarked in his tradition, the pessimistic side, so the sources of pessimism. But nonetheless, reasonableness is not only inclusive, but it's also inclusive. So in this sense, it's inclusive, saying, okay, we all deserve to be together, or more precisely, our reasons deserve to be considered, because we have merits, but nonetheless the burdens of judgment and so on. But on the other hand, it's exclusive, because there are people who are unreasonable. Then again, it's totally clear that most of the discussions about unreasonableness in the Rawlsian tradition are focused on political unreasonableness. So people like racists and so on and so on. And there are even authors like we all know, like Leif Enar, who says that the epistemic condition is even a burden, and Rawlsians would do better without this. But nonetheless, I think that recent events clearly show that this small, I mean, it's not small, it's an important part when he puts it, conclusions of methods of science when they are not controversial, in fact, is very important. I said small because, as we know, Rawls didn't develop this very much, but I think that this indicates, for example, that people who oppose conclusions and methods of science when these are not controversial are unreasonable, and thus the reasons that they offer do not have to be taken in consideration in the process of justification, and certainly not like defeaters.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Now, Professor Samaržija, your question.
Thank you, Elvio. Very interesting, definitely, as always. I'm just wondering, when you are talking about Rawlsian epistemic responsibility, do you, and actually the crucial epistemic value or virtue is reasonableness. And reasonable, we will be, epistemically responsible actually if we are reasonable, or practice reasonableness in the different situation using, you know, the valid public reasons or something like that. I'm just wondering whether you think that this is the intrinsic epistemic value as such, you know, so it's epistemically valuable per se to be reasonable, or you think that, you know, is actually the good way to be at some point, you know, to satisfy the, you know, the norm of truth, or to be, or it is the truth conductive agency, so reasonableness is actually the truth sensitive or truth conductive epistemic agency. So actually you assume that, you know, reasonableness is in some way, you know, connected with the truth, but, you know, we are not, you know, attain truth. We need to be satisfied with reasonableness. I'm just wondering whether you think the reasonableness is really, you know, I mean, intrinsic value, or actually we have, you know, the truth somewhere at the end, and this is the best possible at this particular context or something like that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Snezhana, for the question. So first, as we know, for all reasonableness has not only an epistemic side, there is also the political, but we are focusing now on the epistemic side. So as a RAWLSIAN, I would remain, how to say, detached for the question of truth, and would speak about when doing political philosophy. So RAWLSIANs do not have, so I don't have nothing against truth. So it's not that it's something bad, or that there is pessimism about this, that it's impossible for a human being to achieve this. It's only that in context of reasonable pluralism, instead of looking for truth as the value that confers legitimacy, we must focus on what is realistically at our disposal. And so I would not even speak about reasonableness as the virtue that leads us to truth, because it may be, but I'm not saying fanatically this, as neither does Rawls. It may be that, in fact, the pessimistic view of the science, which are not the postmodernists and so on, speaking about people like Karl Popper, Imre Lakatos, and others, who say that history of science is a cemetery of theories. This indicates maybe that if we look for truth when we are doing political philosophy, we are too unrealistically ambitious. So perhaps it's better to orient ourselves to something more realistic, like, for example, justifying conclusions or decisions through the best reasons that we can have. We cannot establish which are the absolutely best reasons, but each of us can try to do this by the best reasons that this person can have, and then we can have as a community. So there is another reason for not being engaged with truth, and it's the RAWLSIAN intention to avoid the permanent controversies of metaphysical character. Then this would mean entering in the complicated field where philosophers discuss whether truth exists, whether we can reach truth, and so on and so on. And the RAWLSIAN, and so do I, think that this burdens political philosophy. And then for this reason, it's better to limit ourselves to something like reasoning through good reasons or through valid reasons. Personally, my personal opinion is that they are valid reasons, but because they have the best chances to approximate us with truth. But as a RAWLSIAN in political philosophy, I mean, I'm telling you this as a friend. But as a Rawlsian political philosopher, I abstain from declaring this in public. But in any case, what remains is a concept of objectivity, I would say. So this is why I mentioned briefly in passage in the course of my paper that in order to indicate the rival position to Rawls on one side. So on one side is the consent theory or consensus theory that Fabienne mentioned in her paper. On the other side, there is the correctness theory, which many people prefer to call the objective view of justification. And if I'm not wrong, Fabienne does this the same, but she can correct me if I'm wrong. And I think that it's better not to indicate objectivity as the side opposed to Rawls, because Rawlsians appeal to a kind of, at least those most, how to say, loyal to the original program, appeal to a specific kind of objectivity, which is the Kantian view of objectivity, that is objectivity as the consensus of reasonable people. Again, as a friend, I will say, I think this consensus approximates after truth, but okay, just because we are this intimate group of people, I say this, but as a political philosopher, I abstain.
I would like to announce our last but not least important speaker, Iman Cerovac. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Hana. Thank you for organizing this conference. This paper comes in last, and it is a kind of a black sheep, and I will try to explain why it's black sheep. So we started, and for the entire conference, we've readdressed the decline of democracy, decline that can be seen in the decline of quality of results. The quality of results is decreasing. The public will threatens with epistemic and moral catastrophes. And it seems that we need more filtering mechanisms that will filter this public will. And it seems to me that Hana and Marco Luca and Professor Samaržija and many others actually suggested some filtering mechanisms, some mechanism that can filter public will to keep democratic decision-making process, but nonetheless to shape it in a way that it is able to harness the epistemic value of diversity, of expertise, and so on. Now, what I'm going to talk about is actually I'm going to talk against one particular filtering mechanism. And in fact, I'm going to go in a little bit further. I'm not going to claim that in the paper, but it seems to me that this filtering mechanism is one of the causes of the current situation we have with deterioration of the trust in the experts, with the rise of populism, and so on. So I will start by sharing my screen.
We can't see anything. Okay, now we can.
Okay. Okay, is it okay now? Okay. So this talk is composed of 4 parts. I will first give some brief clarifications, just so everyone is on the same page. Then I will talk about democracy and the unequal distribution of political influence, particularly in the informal political sphere. And then I will address one famous argument for unequal distribution of political influence and give an objection to this argument. So that's what this is going to be. Let me start with a few clarifications. Most of us know this. So I start from the standpoint of epistemic democracy, a theory of democracy that ascribes legitimacy, generating potential to democracy, at least in part because of its ability to produce substantively good or correct outcomes. Of course, we know that there are other, this is the standard account of epistemic democracy, rational proceduralism, and so on. Nonetheless, this is my starting point, but you will see that other theories of epistemic democracy are compatible with the rest of this paper. Second, when I talk about informal political public sphere, I'm primarily referring to political campaigns, public rallies, lobbying, negotiations, public relations, political marketing, and other activities that happen in the informal public sphere, that are not part of the formal process, like voting or voting in the parliament, but nonetheless have effect on citizens' opinions and, in the end, their votes. And third important thing, I'm going to approach this topic from the standpoint of, and from the perspective of, liberal criteria of legitimacy. As we all know, Rawls formulated this famous criteria saying that our exercise of political power is fully proper only when this power is exercised in accordance with the Constitution, the essentials of which all citizens as free and equal may reasonably be expected to endorse, and so on. So when I talk and when I discuss different filtering mechanisms, mechanisms for filtering public will, I will address them from the standpoint and look at them through the glance of liberal criteria of legitimacy. So to explain it a little bit further, in order to be able to produce legitimate decisions, a decision-making procedure or decision authorization procedure has to be acceptable to all reasonable or to all qualified citizens. A decision-making procedure has to be justified in terms that are beyond reasonable or qualified objection. And now let me start with the serious introduction, going into the heart of the matter. We usually refer to democracy as a decision-making and decision authorization procedure characterized by some form of political equality, equality of citizens' political influence. The idea roughly is that every citizen has the same chance or the same capability, the same extent of capability to influence the final decisions. Of course, we can see that this equality can be formal and substantial. When we talk about formal political equality, we are primarily referring to voting process and formal political sphere. In a politically equal society, citizens who are citizens who are unequal socially or financially still possess identical voting rights and have the right to expect equitable treatment under the law. And of course, some decision-making and decision authorization procedures, like epistocracy, the rule only of those who know the best, the rule only by the experts, or even scholocracy, Mill's version of, let's call it democracy, characterized by plural voting proposal. Well, these types of decision-making procedures reject formal political equality because they distribute political influence unequally. Epistocracy distributes all political influence only to a small group of citizens, others receive no political influence at all. And scholocracy, of course, gives at least some political influence to virtually all citizens. Nonetheless, since there is a plural voting proposal and there's the idea of plural voting, some citizens, those better educated, those performing more demanding jobs and so on, receive more than one vote. So their political influence is unequal and in this case increased. Now, of course, we know that there is more than one way how a citizen can participate in a decision-making process and shape the final decisions produced by democratic procedure. And one, of course, is within formal political sphere by voting. Another, typical for informal political sphere, is, for example, by contributing money to political campaigns, organizing public rallies, lobbying, influencing public opinion through media, and so on. And now what I want to focus on and what I want to address are mechanisms within informal political sphere. Of course, indirect political sphere cannot influence outcomes directly. It is, after all, votes are what wins elections. Nonetheless, indirect political sphere can be used by parties to influence voting behavior by paying for things for activities and so on, that increase the likelihood that one party's supporters will outnumber those of other parties. For example, we have many mechanisms like getting out and vote, campaigning operations, register drives, and so on, advertisements, campaigns, and so on. So there is a lot of things you can do in the informal political sphere to influence others' opinion and to get them to vote in the way you want them to vote. In other words, there are different ways how you can manifest your political influence in the informal political sphere. And now we come to central critique or the central worry that's been here for the entire conference. And it's put nicely by John Stuart Mill, who says that democracy produces this danger of low political intelligence. Many citizens are unfit to participate in decision-making processes. And we even have this quote by Lord John Austin. I actually read this in Mill, but nonetheless he quotes one of the British conservatives of the 19th century, who says that House of Commons returned by universal suffrage would ruin our finances, destroy economic prosperity, undermine the natural arrangement of society, and so on. So the idea is, if we give every adult citizen a vote, this will result with terrible consequences, with terrible epistemic consequences, with bad policies, with unjust policies, and so on, inefficient policies. So what we need, and what philosophers from the 19th century on have been discussing, are mechanisms that can help us filter public will. How can we harness or at least partially harness the epistemic value of diversity and simultaneously filter public will to prevent these epistemic and moral catastrophes from taking place? And in the 19th century, most of the mechanisms that were suggested were within formal political sphere. John Austin, for example, defends census suffrage. That is, only 5 or 10% of citizens will be allowed to vote based on their income or their wealth. And these citizens this will be a filtering mechanisms, and this will enable uneducated, but also what he would say unproductive or not industrious citizens from entering the public arena. Mill had a somewhat different proposal. We know all about the plural voting proposal, but again, this is a proposal that operates within a formal political sphere. It distributes political influence in the voting process, in the electoral process, and so on. However, in the 20th century, formal equality of political influence is widely accepted, and filtering mechanisms are introduced in the informal political sphere. For example, paid advertisements, public relation experts, appearances in the media, and so on can greatly help one to convey one's political message and one's agenda. And of course, these means are not equally available to every citizen. And therefore, political influence in informal political sphere is unequally distributed, and the main criteria for this unequal distribution is wealth. And what I'm going to argue in the rest of the paper is that this is not a good criteria for unequal distribution of political influence in the informal political sphere. So what we might ask ourselves are these filtering mechanisms epistemically justified, those based on wealth? Do they improve quality of political outcomes? And can they be endorsed by all qualified citizens beyond qualified rejection? And of course, I claim that the answer is no for all three of these questions. And I'm not going into detail. I believe that other philosophers in the 19th century have already discussed this thoroughly. Mill writes that government is not a joint stock company where every stakeholder has political influence in proportion to the number of shares belonging to him. The criteria for unequal distribution should not be wealth. And even some contemporary economists indicate that campaign contributions lead to a wealth bias in the political process, since a decisive agent whose preferences will prevail in equilibrium will be wealthier than the median. The end results are such that they do not correspond and do not answer properly to the interests of the majority of people. And now, is there any way we can defend an equal distribution of political influence based on the criteria of wealth in informal political sphere? And can we do so on the epistemic grounds? It seems to me that there is one such attempt. And it's an attempt by David Eslund, who basically says more input in public deliberation is usually epistemically better. The more input we have, the more input citizens have, the higher quality of final decisions will be. So if we have two states, one in which every citizen has an amount of political input equal to 2, let's say he writes 2 letters to his congressman or something like that, and another state in which every citizen has a political input equal to 5 units, well, we should prefer S2 over S1, because more political input generally leads to better quality of outcomes. Nonetheless, there seems to be a problem, namely, some unequal distributions of political input might increase the total level of political input. So, as you can see in this case, we can imagine another S3, state 3, in which political input is unequally distributed. And if S2 cannot be achieved, if it's just an ideal state, what should we favor, S1 or S3? David Eslund and many others actually believe that we should favor S3 over S1. Why should we do that? Well, total level of political input in S3 is increased. So we have more political input that will increase the quality of decisions. Those who are worst off still have considerably more political input than they had in the best feasible equality. And difference between political input of members of different social groups is not so great that it would reduce the epistemic value of increased level of total political input. And this is what Eslund, but also some other social epistemologists call epistemic difference principle. And now I have some reservations about this, this difference principle, and the rest of the talk I'm going to address them. To clarify a little bit further what epistemic difference principle implies is that once we have achieved maximal equal political input and someone wants to invest additional resources to increase his or her political input, we should allow that. Of course, this additional input should be taxed for the benefit of the worst off. And now I want to raise a demographic objection against this unequal distribution of political influence. And the demographic objection typically states that there might be some feature or some features common in all citizens with greater political input that nullifies the epistemic advantage of increased total political input. For example, imagine that all who have greater political input, for example, who are wealthier and can pay for additional or can make larger donations to political campaigns and so on, are statistically more sexist or more racist than others. In such instances, the portion of the population with greater political input may disproportionately indeed have epistemically damaging features that in the end countervail the admitted epistemic benefits of increased total political input. And in fact, that is often the case in contemporary societies. Having greater political input and having greater wealth is disproportionately the privilege of members of certain races, classes, and genders. And even if everyone acts with or in goodwill, people are inevitably biased by their race, class, and gender. Giving greater political input and influence to any of these groups only worsens the effect of these biases, damaging the expected quality of collective decisions. And the question that arises, and the central question here is is it unreasonable to believe that there are some such epistemically latent features, some features that might be present in groups that have greater political influence? And though this need not be true, it's definitely not something that's unreasonable. And here is the catch. So if it's not unreasonable to think that there might be some epistemically latent features, then we have a problem with the liberal criteria of legitimacy. Because let's recall, it requires that a decision-making procedure has to be justified in terms that are beyond qualified or reasonable objection. And it seems that, provided that we acknowledge that there might be some epistemically latent features in groups that have a larger amount of political influence, and if we endorse the idea that this might be reasonable, then epistemic difference principle is not beyond reasonable or qualified objection. So to sum up and to finish, a decision-making procedure that distributes citizens' input and influence on the grounds of wealth cannot have legitimacy generating potential. A procedure that introduces equality only in the formal political sphere, like we have nowadays, and allows inequalities in wealth to create inequalities of political influence in informal political sphere, cannot have or should not have legitimacy generating potential. This, of course, does not imply, and I'm by no means saying that other filtering mechanisms should not be employed. All I'm actually saying is that wealth, which it seems nowadays one of the most important filtering mechanisms of public will, is not the epistemically appropriate filtering mechanism of public will. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan, very much. This was, as you always do, very clear, very concise. So I would like to start opening the floor for questions. Do we have some raised hands? Not yet. Would somebody like to ask a question? Maybe you would like to stop screen sharing because we can see your emails.
Sorry, didn't know that's the case. Just a second. So I should go there. Nope. Sorry. Okay, you can see my email. It's nothing. I have no idea how to start sharing.
Two questions, and then I would like to ask one. First, Professor Baccarini.
Okay.
Maybe Andrei before me, because I have the possibility to speak with Ivan the whole day, and I suppose that Ivan will be more interested in hearing people that are not from our department. So.
Okay, Andrei.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity. As far as I understand, the people from 19th century who advocated for more political influence for richer people, their logic was that the richer you are, the smarter you are, the better you are in all possible respects, the more virtuous you are anyway. So isn't this a reasonable idea? And just like wealthy people may be more racist, more sexist, and so on, and tilt the political scale onto a bad side, maybe the richer people, the more money people have, the better they are, the more virtuous they are. Isn't it a reasonable position?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I'm not sure. I'm quite sure that this will not be a position that is beyond reasonable objection. So the thing is, it seems to me that we would need really good. So in order to distribute political influence unequally, we would need to have some model of distribution that is acceptable to all reasonable citizens. And now I can see your point, and especially I think even David Esseln discusses this. Well, not necessarily wealth, but imagine, for example, education. Isn't education something that should make one better decision maker, and thus shouldn't those who have received better education also have greater political influence, especially in the formal political sphere? And this is what John Stuart Mill had in mind. And now Esseln basically builds his case, which I then copy and use it in the informal political sphere, by saying that, well, that just might be the case. Of course, that might be the case. Nonetheless, some other things might be the case as well. And as we know from experience and from history, those members of groups who have had greater political influence were often members of some social groups, and it's not unreasonable to think that such social groups might be subject to some known or even unknown biases. And the entire epistemic argument for unequal distribution of political influence goes towards the idea that this will increase the quality of political decisions. Nonetheless, one might reasonably say, well, it might not. We never know. At least in some cases, it can be the case that it will in fact reduce the quality of political decisions. In such instances, and we can't determine which these instances are, so in all instances, we have no other way than to say that this is a reasonable objection, and as such that we cannot push unequal distribution of political influence.
Okay, thank you, Andre. Thank you, Ivan. I think, Professor Baccarini, that you can ask your question now.
Okay, thank you, Hana. So Ivan, I would like to hear some of your comments about this unequal influence and difference in wealth. To what principle you would exactly orient your position? Because in some sense, it seems to me, at least at first sight, the sufficientarianism appears as almost the logical consequence of what you were saying, because we have a problem, unequal distribution of influence, and how much do we have to reduce socioeconomic differences, as much as to render not deleterious the social differences for the distribution of influence in the process you are speaking about. But it seems to me that you want to go more strongly than this.
Okay, so in fact, in this paper, I did not give some solutions, though I can answer your question and give two. I think that might be that might be worthy of discussion. So the first one is the answer from the non-ideal theory. And that would basically be to say, we don't need to cut inequalities in wealth, in finances, and so on. What we have to do is to cut the link between economic inequalities and inequalities in the informal political sphere. For example, by saying you cannot donate more than some fixed amount of money to political campaigns. You cannot appear, you cannot own more than this or that number of media houses, and so on and so on. Nonetheless, of course, this might limit some of the freedoms, including freedom of expression and so on. The other answer comes from more ideal theory, is basically to say, no, since this won't be feasible, we will constantly have to monitor who owns which media house, how often one pays for advertisements, and so on and so on. We should in fact solve the problem by distributing wealth and economic power equally. And that would go probably in the direction of some form of property owning democracy or something like that. So it really depends on whether we are discussing this within ideal or non-ideal theory.
Okay, thank you. I would just like to wrap up our conference with a couple of words. I know we're all tired. I know we've lasted the entire day, and we're actually a bit ahead of time, so I want to end while we're still fresh. So, dear participants, dear guests, I want to thank you all again for a profoundly invigorating day and a stimulating discussion. Many thanks go to our keynote lecturers, Qasim and Fabienne, who lasted the entire day with us. Many thanks to Christopher, who was busy with child care and homeschooling. Thanks to all remaining speakers, and thanks to Lucia from the Center of Advanced Studies for hosting the event with me. Although our questions about the role of truth in politics remain open, we in the organizing committee believe that we have come one step closer in thinking about their consequences. I will send you the full recording of our conference as soon as we've edited it. And if you want to be added to the mailing list, contact me at the email address I will now write in the comments. Thank you all again. Great job, people. I hope to
organizing.
Thank you for attending.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all. Bye. Bye.
Take care. Take care, everybody.